The late afternoon sun streamed through the half-open curtains, casting long, golden streaks across the tiled floor. She had always loved this time of day, the brief moments of solitude before the household buzzed back to life. Standing in the bathroom, wrapped in nothing but steam, she reached for her towel and paused, catching a glimpse of herself in the fogged-up mirror. A woman in her late 30s stared back, her damp hair clinging to her shoulders, her expression pensive. She didn't look unhappy, but she didn't look fulfilled either. Life had settled into predictable patterns, a husband more preoccupied with work than with her, days filled with errands and chores, and evenings spent in shared silence. It wasn't a bad life, she told herself, just lacking. The thought was fleeting, something she pushed away each time it surfaced. She sighed, wrapping the towel around her and stepping toward the bedroom. The sound of the front door opening jolted her from her thoughts. A familiar voice called out, her nephew. He had arrived earlier that week, seeking a place to stay while sorting out some issues in his own life. At 21, he was confident in a way that both amused and unsettled her, carrying himself with an ease that reminded her of her younger self. Just got back from the gym, he announced, his voice echoing down the hall. She could hear the faint clink of keys landing on the table. "You here?" "Yes," she called back, her tone casual, though her heart skipped slightly. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the sudden intrusion into her private moment, or perhaps it was something else, something she wasn't ready to examine too closely. She turned toward the wardrobe, loosening the towel to slip into her clothes. That's when it happened. The door, which she had assumed was firmly shut, eased open just enough to reveal his silhouette. Her breath caught. His eyes widened in instant shock as they locked onto hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Time seemed to freeze, the world outside the narrow crack of the door disappearing entirely. "Sorry," he blurted, stumbling backward and fumbling to close the door. The sound of it clicking shut echoed louder than it should have. She stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing. Had he seen anything? Her bare shoulders? The curve of her back? The thought sent a flush of heat rising to her cheeks, equal parts embarrassment and something she couldn't quite name. "It's fine," she managed after a moment, her voice steadier than she felt. But it wasn't fine. Not entirely. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, or so it appeared on the surface. Her husband was home late, as usual, eating dinner distractedly while scrolling through his phone. Her nephew, seated across from her at the dining table, seemed unusually quiet. She caught him stealing glances at her once or twice, his expression unreadable. She tried to dismiss the incident as a meaningless accident, a moment of poor timing. Yet, as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind replayed the scene over and over. She told herself it was absurd to dwell on it. He was just a boy. Well, not a boy, but young enough to be one in her eyes. Still, there was no denying the way his gaze had lingered, even for that brief second. The days that followed seemed oddly charged. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but there was a shift in their interactions. He was always around, offering to help with groceries, fixing small things around the house, making her laugh with his easy charm. She found herself noticing things she hadn't before. The way his arms tensed when he lifted heavy bags, the playful smirk he gave when he teased her about her cooking. She told herself she was imagining it, that there was nothing different about him or the way he looked at her. But the awareness was there, a silent undercurrent she couldn't ignore. One afternoon, as she folded laundry in the living room, he joined her, plopping down onto the couch with a casualness that belied the tension she felt. "You okay?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes searching. "Of course," she replied, not looking up from the towel she was folding. "You've seemed—" "I don't know," distracted, he said. She paused, her hands stilling on the fabric. "Just busy, I guess." "Right?" He didn't press further, but she felt his gaze linger. Later that day, as she cleaned the bathroom, her mind wandered to the moment in the doorway again. She tried to dismiss it as a harmless memory, something she would laugh about one day. But the truth was it wasn't harmless. Not entirely. It wasn't just his age that complicated things. It was who he was, family, though not in the closest sense. The thought should have been enough to quell whatever stirrings she felt, but it wasn't. As the evening wore on, she caught him watching her again, his eyes holding hers for a moment too long. She felt a mix of emotions she couldn't name: flattery, guilt, and something more dangerous. That night, as she lay in bed, her husband snoring softly beside her, she found herself unable to sleep. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She got up, padding softly down the hallway. Her pulse quickened. She kept her eyes on the cutting board, afraid that looking at him would betray too much. "I'm fine," she replied, too quickly. "You don't seem fine," he pressed, his tone softer now, almost teasing. She paused, the knife hovering over the half-chopped onion. "I've just been busy," she said, her voice steadier this time. "Busy avoiding me?" Her hand stilled, and she finally turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. His words hung in the air between them, daring her to respond. For a moment, she considered denying it, brushing off his comment with a laugh or a change of subject. But the look in his eyes, intense, searching, made it clear he wouldn't believe her anyway. "I'm not avoiding you," she said finally, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he held her gaze, his silence heavy with unspoken meaning. Then he smiled, a small, knowing curve of his lips that unsettled her more than any words could have. "Good," he said simply, setting the empty glass down on the counter before walking away. Her hands trembled as she returned to the task at hand, the knife slipping once and nicking the edge of her finger. She cursed under her breath, more at herself than at the minor injury. It wasn't just him. It was her own inability to draw a clear boundary, her own quiet thrill at the way he looked at her, spoke to her, stayed near her. She should have stopped this days ago, made it clear that whatever unspoken thing was growing between them had no place in her life. But she hadn't, and now it felt as though she couldn't. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, her husband buried in his work emails, her nephew sprawled out on the couch, she felt his gaze on her again. She kept her focus on the television, refusing to acknowledge the way her skin prickled under his attention. When her husband finally excused himself to take a phone call in the other room, the tension in the air grew palpable. She could feel her nephew watching her, could almost hear the unspoken words in his mind. "You're not happy, are you?" he said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet. She turned to him, startled. "What are you talking about?" "You and him," he said, nodding toward the hallway where her husband had disappeared. "You're just going through the motions." "That's none of your business," she said, her voice sharp, but her heart raced at the accuracy of his observation. "I'm not trying to pry," he said, sitting up now, his expression earnest. I see how he treats you. Like you're part of the furniture or something." "Stop," she said, her tone firmer this time. "This conversation ends here." He held up his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes never left hers. "I'm just saying, you deserve more than that." She stood abruptly, muttering something about needing to check on dinner. As she walked away, she felt his gaze follow her, heavy and unrelenting. Later that night, she found herself standing on the back porch, the cool night air a welcome relief against her flushed skin. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out into the darkness and willing her thoughts to quiet. The sound of the sliding door behind her made her tense, but she didn't turn around. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft. She shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the yard. "Just needed some air." He stepped up beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him in the cool night. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. "You don't have to keep pushing me away," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned to him then, her heart pounding. Whatever this is, it has to stop," she said, though the conviction in her voice wavered. "Why?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Because it's wrong, she said, the words coming out more as a plea than a declaration. His hand brushed against hers, a light, tentative touch that sent a shiver through her. It doesn't feel wrong, he said, his voice steady. She pulled her hand away, stepping back as though distance could erase the line they were so dangerously close to crossing. It doesn't matter how it feels, she said, though her own words felt like a lie. He didn't move closer, but his presence was overwhelming nonetheless. I'm not trying to hurt you, he said. I can't pretend I don't feel this. Stop, she said again, her voice breaking. He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, stepping back and leaving her alone on the porch. She stood there long after he had gone, the cool air doing little to calm the storm, and he reached out then, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm. The touch sent a shiver through her, and she hated how much she wanted more. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice firm but gentle. If you really want me to, tell me and I will. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him exactly that. But the words wouldn't come. She stood there, frozen, caught between the life she knew and the pull of something she couldn't name but couldn't deny. Her silence was answer enough. In one swift motion, he closed the distance between them, his lips finding hers with a hunger that mirrored her own. The kiss was urgent, desperate, as though both of them knew this was a line they could never uncross. Her hands found their way to his chest, not to push him away, but to pull him closer. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the rain, the house, the world beyond them. There was only this, only him. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. She stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, desire, guilt, fear. We can't, she said, her voice shaky. This will ruin everything. It's already ruined, he said, his tone raw. I can't pretend anymore. And neither can you. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself, as though trying to hold herself together. I need to think, she said, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Take all the time you need, he said, though his eyes told her he didn't believe she would come to a different conclusion. She retreated to her room, closing the door behind her and leaning against it. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing. She had crossed the line, the one she had told herself she would never even approach. And now there was no going back. The next morning, the house felt different. The tension was still there, but it had shifted, transformed into something heavier, more dangerous. She avoided him as much as she could, throwing herself into chores and errands that didn't need doing. But every time she caught a glimpse of him, her resolve wavered. That evening, as the sun set and the house grew quiet, she found herself standing outside his room. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her mind screaming at her to turn around, to walk away. But her heart, or perhaps something deeper, pushed her forward. She opened the door to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard her, his expression a mix of surprise and hope. I can't do this, she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. But I can't stop either. He stood, crossing the room in a few quick strides. Then don't, he said, his voice firm but tender. She didn't resist as he pulled her into his arms, their lips meeting once again. This time, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. It was reckless and selfish and entirely wrong. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing that made sense. When it was over, they lay in silence, the weight of what they had done settling over them like a heavy blanket. She stared at the ceiling, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. She had wanted this, had chosen it, but now that it was real, she couldn't ignore the consequences that loomed ahead. He turned to her, his fingers tracing light patterns on her arm. What now? He asked, his voice soft. She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that nothing would ever be the same. The line they had crossed could never be erased, and the life she had known was slipping away, piece by piece. As she got up to leave, he caught her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "Don't shut me out," he said. She didn't reply, but the look in her eyes was enough to tell him that she already had. As she closed the door behind her, the weight of her choices pressed down on her. There was no going back, but the path ahead was darker than she had ever imagined. And as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized she was no closer to understanding what she truly wanted, or what she had already lost.